Hope no one's allergic to fish, because that's what we're having tonight. Now, I didn't catch them myself, but they're still fresh. I had to pay one of the local fishermen to catch a few for us, because I'm not really in the mood to drive out 50 miles to find the nearest grocery store and buy some frozen fish. And it's not like I'm suddenly going to learn how to fish in one day. I know, surprising, a hunter who doesn't know how to fish, but I've never been able to get the hang of it. First, I can't tell the difference between when the line is being pulled by a fish and when it's just the current taking it. And second, even if I do feel like the line is being pulled, the hook always gets stuck on a rock. And finally, I personally feel like it's quite boring. Yes, you're spending time with nature and whatnot, but it's not like I can't feel that while I'm hunting. At least your mind is always engaged in trying to find any animal that might be nearby. When you fish, you literally just sit there and wait for something to happen. So, excuse my lack of enthusiasm for the sport. And in the local area, all the fish seem to like the taste of worm the best, and I'm not about to touch those things anytime soon. If you didn't already know, I'm pretty disgusted by worms. They're slimy, they look creepy, and I can never get the image of worms just crawling into my skin out of my head whenever I see one. I wouldn't necessarily say it's a phobia, just a general disgust. And if you think they're just a few inches at most, you'd be wrong. The largest worm found was 21 feet long. 21 feet. And yes, I know they're not going to try to kill you, at least most of them. But that isn't going to change the fact that I don't need the image of a 21-foot long worm inside of my body. As for the ones that can kill you, I know they don't crawl through your skin or anything. But I guess seeing the image of worms crawling through a corpse and then imagining someone being alive at the same time, yeah, that's pretty terrifying. You know, and this might be a bit graphic, so if you're easily disturbed, you might want to walk out for a second. Alright. One method of execution back in ancient Persia was called scaphism. You see, they would force feed you honey and milk. Doesn't sound too bad, right? I mean, after all, these were coveted things to eat back then. But the issue came from what that would do to your stomach. It's not like some sort of chemical explosion would occur, but more specifically, your bowels would sound like crazy. I myself have several stomach issues, so I can only imagine how much the combination would sound for me. After this, they would use a mixture of milk and honey to smother your skin. And keep in mind, you would be naked. And from there, they would tie you to something, typically a boat or a log. From there, the sound of your bowels would alert every bug in the area, and they would eat the sugary contents in your skin. And then start eating you. And yes, you were alive throughout the whole process. I can only imagine all those grubs eating into you, and then I imagine the combination of that with worms. It's horrible. I hope it didn't make any of you lose your appetite. To those who walked out, you can come back. Alright. Anyways, I'm actually a bit surprised they never attempted to practice anything like that in Mongolia. I mean, given the size of the carnivorous worms that are said to live there. Oh. I'm assuming you're not entirely sure what I'm talking about, huh? Alright. Take a seat, grab your food, and get comfortable by the fire. And let me tell you the story of shifting sands in the Mongolian Desert. The Gobi Desert, also shortened to just simply Gobi, means waterless place in Mongol, and it's the largest desert in Asia, being only a little smaller than twice the size of Texas. It resides within Mongolia to the northwest of China, just above the end of the Himalayas, and is bordered by the Taklamakan Desert, only separated by the basin of Darim and the desert basin of Lopnar and Hami. In the west, you'll experience a rainfall of less than 2 inches, and in the northeast, there's roughly 8 inches of rain throughout the year. The west is about 30% drier than the driest region in the US, and even the northeast is about 4 times drier than the average place in the US. Temperatures in the Gobi are typically intolerably cold. You see, despite what some may think, deserts are not characterized by their heat. Instead, they are specifically characterized by their lack of rainfall and moisture. While most deserts tend to be hot, in the case of the Gobi, it's quite the opposite. And in fact, the largest desert in the world is also the coldest region in the world. That is, the entire continent of Antarctica. Going back to the Gobi, temperatures there can reach freezing levels, and only in the hottest of months are when the temperatures reach anything normal for the average person. And even then, you can see temperatures fluctuate greatly. One day, the temperature may be as high as 60 degrees Fahrenheit, but then suddenly drop to -3 one day. The average ambient temperature of the Gobi tends to be anywhere from 27 to 30 degrees Fahrenheit, and in the coldest of months you can see temperatures as low as -24, and in the hottest months as high as 64. Although in the south temperatures can reach up to 99, and when seasons are changing, monsoons come, and the wind makes the temperatures violently change. With the wind, the coldest temperatures have reached as low as -40, and as high as 113. While most of us are used to a range of temperatures, this range is so much larger than anything we're used to, God only knows how anyone can get used to that. Despite the violently changing temperatures, though, there are plenty of animals that are not just capable of surviving within the environment, but thrive. There are the Bactrian camels, known for their very shaggy coats and 2 humps. There's the very rare Przewalski horse, known as Taki by the population, meaning spirit. These horses are untamed because of the locals' reverence of the horse, and while they did face extinction, they've been preserved through human intervention. Wild donkeys also reside in the desert, which are just as untamed as the Przewalski horse. The Agarli, which literally translates to sheep in Mongol, inhabits the mountain ranges near the desert. Plenty of venomous snakes also hide in the deserts, such as the Siberian pit viper or the Central Asian pit viper. The jerboa can also be found there, a creature that resembles a rat with kangaroo legs. Bears at one point could also be found there, but unfortunately there's only about 40 that remain as of today. They're so rare, in fact, that if you were to wander the deserts for whatever reason, perhaps there's a higher chance for you to encounter another creature, a monster that strikes the locals with fear to such a degree that some outright refuse to talk about it. A monster of death that can end your life by merely being in its presence. The indigenous people call it the Algohoi Krakoi, meaning large intestinal worm. But people in the West know it by a different name, one that more accurately reflects the dangerous nature of the creature: the Mongolian deathworm. The Mongolian deathworm, also known as the Algohoi Krakoi by the indigenous people, is a worm-like creature residing within the Gobi Desert. Despite how it may sound, the creature's native name comes from the creature's resemblance to freshly cut out cow intestines, not because it's an intestinal worm. The creature is a blood-red, earthworm-looking creature that can be anywhere from 2 to 5 feet in length and about a foot in width. It has been described with rough-looking skin, presumably a hide in order to protect against the sand's friction when it moves into the sand. Its head is indistinguishable from its tail, but God forbid you ever get close to that head, because the Mongolian deathworm is infamous for spitting a thick venom that sticks to you and can sear the flesh off of anyone that approaches it, like some sort of hot acidic slime. The substance is so powerful that some of the locals have reported that it is even capable of corroding metal. The agony is immeasurable, but that's entirely assuming it doesn't just kill you instantly. Assuming you somehow avoided instant death by the poisonous spit, the worm has another method of execution: electricity. You see, the worm can emit a voltage so powerful that despite the sand in the air's inability to effectively transmit electricity, it can still kill humans, horses, and camels practically instantly from just a few feet away. It has never really been seen eating one of its victims, either because once a deathworm's presence has been revealed and it has claimed a life, no one sticks around long enough to find out what it does with the body, or because the creature is simply being territorial or defensive. If anyone is feeling adventurous enough to even attempt to be anywhere near this monster, then you'll only be able to find it between June and July, and then never again until the following year. It is likely best to seek it towards the end of July, since the once death spit is known to lose its potency as time goes on. But it's far from non-lethal or painless. But at least you won't die instantly, and perhaps there will be a chance to save you. If you're still suicidal enough to attempt to find this creature, then according to the locals, you can find it in the south parts of Mongolia, where it borders China. And if it's raining, then your chances increase even more, but of course the Gobi is called the Waterless Place for a reason. The creature has been known to surface near yurts that are collecting rainwater, and once it does, all the locals abandon the yurt out of sheer terror, never even trying to attack the creature, even when faced with the lack of water. Because, as far as the natives know, anyone who has attempted to attack the monster has known instant death. Thrill seekers take heed. The death worm may lose its potency as its months of dormancy approach, but its instinctive territorial nature will never leave it. And its need to kill anything it considers a threat has never once waned for the thought of incapacitation. Once it deems you a threat, it will kill you. Always. Thus its name, the Mongolian Deathworm. Roy Chapman Andrews was an American naturalist and paleontologist, among other things, who had eventually become the director of the American Museum of Natural History. His contributions to the paleontological world were numerous, such as his and his team's discovery of the first dinosaur eggs in the nest, the discovery of the Paracatherium, the largest known mammal in the history of the prehistoric world, and the Andrewsarchus, who is named after him, a large hippo-pig-like mammal known for being the largest terrestrial carnivorous mammal to have ever lived. Most of his work was in Asia, in Mongolia and China specifically, despite the dangerous political climate present within both countries at the time. Mongolia at the time didn't really allow any outsiders to come in, so Andrews needed permission to explore the Gobi Desert in order to search for any fossils. To get this permission, he needed to meet with the Mongolian cabinet at the Foreign Office. When he arrived, he was surprised to see people of significant status there, such as the Minister of Foreign Affairs and the Mongolian Premier, a position of whom I am not entirely sure exists anymore, but one who I assume is of some significant status. They explained to Andrews that they would give him the permission he wished for, so long as he would be willing to provide them a specimen of a creature that they had no doubt was real, but one who they have never seen before. His account is as such.
Then the Premier asked that if it were possible, I should capture for the Mongolian government a specimen of the Algohai Harhai. None of those present had ever seen the creature, but they all believe in its existence and describe it minutely. It is so poisonous that merely to touch it means instant death. It lives in the most desolate parts of the Gobi Desert, whither we were going. For the Mongols, it seems to be what the dragon is to the Chinese. The Premier said, although he had never seen it himself, he knew a man who had lived to tell the tale. Then a cabinet minister stated that the cousin of his late wife's sister had also seen it. I promised to produce the Algohai Harhai if we chanced to cross its path, and explained how it could be seized by means of long steel collecting forceps. Moreover, I could wear dark glasses so that disastrous effects of even looking at so poisonous a creature would be neutralized. The meeting was adjourned with best of feelings.
While Andrews had agreed to catching specimens, if possible, he admitted in his book that he had no belief that such a creature could exist, and that it was likely more fictional than anything else. His mention of the Mongolian deathworm in his book, The New Conquest of Central Asia, was the first ever in the West, and from there few had ever heard of the deathworm until more explorations were done in order to attempt to find the creature. However, the creature had never stopped filling terror within the souls of the residents of Mongolia. Ivan Makreli is a notable Czech cryptozoologist who is known for his expeditions into the Gobi Desert in search for the infamous Mongolian death worm. Ivan led a team of 6, of whom consisted of a physician, a doctor, a photographer, and 2 natives of Mongolia. The first expedition took place on June and July of 1990, where they searched for the beast west of Dalanzadgad, a city in Mongolia towards the southern border of the country. Their original plan was to lay bait for the creature and trap it when it arose from the ground, but since none of the natives could tell them of what the creature ate, they instead decided to go to the regions where they were known to exist, and from there implant a wooden stake into the ground and start producing vibrations. While this may seem odd at first, this is a common tactic used by worm farmers to force worms to surface. This happens because the worms believe the vibrations are coming from a mole and so surface to escape what they conceive to be a predator. The team was hoping the vibrations would have a similar effect. Except they weren't exactly expecting for the vibrations to make the worms surface for the same reason. Instead, their theory was that the vibrations would simulate the sensation of rain. You see, the worm is notorious for surfacing when it feels rain, and perhaps the vibrations against the sand would produce the same effect. Alas, nothing came of it. The worm never surfaced, and the team left without a shred of physical evidence. However, the tales from the locals all kept them from losing hope. 2 years later, at the same time of the month, the same group, this time with different natives, went to search for the monster again. They searched around the same area again, however, in regions the locals reported would offer an even greater chance for locating the worm. This time they were armed with explosives, and they detonated them across the landscape, in hopes that the shockwaves would bring the worms to the surface. However, once again, they were not met with a single death worm. One last team was dispatched to attempt to find the worm, although their visit was not solely for this purpose. However, much like the last 2 expeditions, nothing came from it, and not a single team member witnessed the worm. Perhaps this was for the better. As for the few who actually can testify to the worm's existence, they have witnessed what the monster is capable of, and nothing but death meets those who find themselves confronted by the monstrosity. The Gobi is home to plenty of interesting geological phenomena, such as the Flaming Cliffs, also known as the Jajaka Formation, the place where the first dinosaur eggs were discovered, and the Namek Formation, a place rich of fossils of countless species throughout paleontological history. In the 1960s, a group of geologists decided to research these primordial structures and the rich secrets they hide of the ancient world. While visiting one of the southern regions, they made camp within the region of Jojotka to research the Flaming Cliffs and the primordial sediment that resides within. Towards the beginning of the dusk, one geologist was using a metal rod he had picked up nearby and was poking the sand. He was going to be looking for any basalt or granite sediments in the area that he could find, and while he didn't exactly assume that this would be a viable method to unearth a primitive volcanic rock, perhaps he would find something else. His colleagues were nearby in their camps attempting to map out the rock formations and specific sediments found within those regions, as well as their significance. This wasn't exactly his favorite part of his job. He had been on that for the past 4 hours, so this was his break to just be mindless for a little while. He walked around for a bit, taking in the awe of the Flaming Cliffs. He saw how the light of the dusk emblazed the cliffs with a brilliant hue of blazing red. He had heard how the formation got its name, but seeing it in person is nothing in comparison. He continued poking around in the sand, keeping his mind with simple thought as he took in the scenery. He collapsed to the ground in an instant. His colleagues heard the thud and rushed over to where they had heard him fall. They found him lying on the floor face down, and when they touched his body to turn him over, they noticed his body was unusually hot. They frantically checked for a pulse, but found none. He was gone before he had even hit the ground. In front of him was the metal rod he had been using with detailed finger marks where he had gripped the bar. And in front of it, beneath those terrible sands, moved a large red mass. It burrowed beneath the sands, never to be seen again by the scientists. In the middle of July a few decades ago, Atlan, a Mongolian shepherd, was returning to his camp after visiting a neighboring one with one of his friends, who we'll call Gon. The sun was at its apex, and despite it being the middle of the summer, the day was unusually cold, but not cold enough to merit any sort of discomfort. Quite the contrary, the mild temperature was quite perfect. They predicted that it would take until the sun crowned the highest peak to get back to their camp, so a while. Atlan and Gon were conversing, primarily about the chores that they had to do when they got back, and trying to one-up the other in terms of what they had to do when they got back to their homes. Atlan explained that he had to help his brother feed the sheep, but then Gon retorted how he had to do the same, but he had to do it alone, without the luxury of anyone to help him. Atlan then explained that they had to feed 160 sheep, and God said that that was nothing, and that he had to feed 200 sheep, and again, by himself. Gon said that afterwards his wife was on him about fixing some chairs in his house, but Atlan responded by wishing that he only had to fix 2 chairs, as he had to fix chairs and tables for his mother. They kept going on about what they had to do, explaining to each other about how what they had to do was so much more. Eventually, the conversation turned to mocking and laughter. Gon's horse suddenly dropped to the floor. Atlan was only 5 meters away, shocked about what just happened, too stunned to do anything. As the horse's body was crushing his leg, Gon yelled in pain and yelled at Atlan to help him. He didn't waste any time trying to rely on him though, and he mustered all the strength, and after much struggling and cursing, he was finally able to pull his leg from under the horse's torso. He felt as if his arms were about to fold in, and as if his leg was about to be torn off. When he found the strength to stand up, he got up from the ground. The pain in his leg intensified, and he noticed the burn of the scrapes on his arms and his elbows, and the pain on his temple after hitting a small rock. As he was counting his injuries, the sand next to the body of his once breathing stallion started moving towards him. In an instant, he recognized exactly what had brought his horse's life to an end, and his eyes were filled with terror. Right as he let out a yell of pure fright, a zap echoed through the sands, and in a moment, the breath from both his lungs and his soul escaped, and he fell to the ground, dead, before the sands could even receive him. Atlan witnessed the horror that arose from the sands around them, red as the blood of a cow, elongated but thick like a sausage, horrifying as the worst demons from hell, and terrible like the devil himself. The Algoi Glokoi, the demon of the sands, was just 5 meters away, and its terrible venom was already beginning to build up in its mouth. He kicked the horse and they both ran out of there before the devil could possibly lay waste to their lives as well. The shepherd was one of the few who had ever encountered the monster and lived to tell the tale. South of Noyon, a herd of 12 camels were being transported to one of the neighboring cities to be sold. These were prized, purebred Bactrian camels, never mixed with any others with conditions. They produced the softest wool that was so clean it practically shined in the morning sun, and milk so delectable anyone would be willing to give up an ounce of water for a week for just the chance to try a sip. So great and prized were these camels that each one would easily reach more than 2 million tugrats. And that is probably the minimum. The camel herders were proud of their herd, and with such a prestigious buyer looking to buy from them, their spirits were high. They had been looking forward to this day for a long while, and not just for the money. That was just a confirmation of what they were really seeking. Praise for their abilities from someone with status. Not much beats the sensation that is felt when someone of considerable position congratulates and praises your work. Across the Gobi they walked in the warmth of the sun. Even the weather was just right. And as they were walking, one of the camels stepped on something, and the herder noticed the odd indent in the sand for the half second before the camel's legs gave in and its body lay on the ground. The herders began to panic. They had promised the buyer 12 camels, and they had no other prize camels to give. Their panic somehow took precedent over their safety or even the safety of the camels. At least until they started to notice each of the camels beginning to fall to the ground 2 by 2, and the sand was rising and falling beneath their feet. The camels themselves began to panic, and they ran as far as they could, never to be seen by the herders again. The corpses of the camels lay on the ground with smoke arising from their hides. 8 of the camels lay dead, and the herders panicked for their own lives when they saw the displaced sand coming straight towards them. They ran as far as they could, and the shifting sand eventually relented. All sorts of profanities and cries came from the herders. In but a few minutes, they had lost the most prized herd of their lives. What would have likely been up to 40 million or more tugrats, and all the dignity and respect they were hoping for. And had they not made a run for it, perhaps their very lives as well. It was a cold summer night, but the chill of the air did not deter young Narmadak from playing for later than he probably should have. His parents were talking about a serious issue going on in the camp, and their main concern now was more focused on the problem than Narmadak's bedtime. Well, little Narmadak loved to find things in the sand, weird rocks, bugs, lizards. He even one time found a snake and always asked questions about what it is he found, and he almost gave his mother a heart attack when he showed her the snake. Using his imagination, he made stories with the things he found, and even though all the other boys in the camp were likely fast asleep, he was able to find plenty of entertainment in this. He was playing a story where he was acting as Jangar, fighting against the evil monsters of the story. At the height of his battle, he heard moving in a box near him, like the sand being displaced. Still acting as the adventurous Jangar, and half expecting to find a lizard or perhaps a snake, he snuck up on the box and jumped to scare whatever was inside. Instead of instilling fright, however, fright was instilled in him. You see, inside the box was what looked like a snake, but it was very red, and the skin was far from smooth. Not to mention he couldn't tell the difference between the head and the tail. It was big, much bigger than any snake that he had ever seen. It was digging into the sand, not paying much attention to him. But all of Narmadak's attention was on the thing that was in front of him. The skin seemed so different from anything he had ever touched before, and his curiosity compelled him to touch it. After all, he was the brave Jangar, and if the creature ever tried to attack him, he'd kill it. His parents heard the lack of commotion, and then heard the thud and rushed outside. They saw their boy lying on the ground, motionless, and a red demon digging in the sands next to him. The devastation and overwhelming sensation of misery instantly took them, and in retaliation they grabbed weapons and ran towards the creature to kill it. His father grabbed a hatchet and his mother grabbed a wooden rod next to them, and they both attacked the monster. Their neighbors had heard the commotion, and the only indication to know what had happened to them was something red shifting in the sands beneath them. So, Gymnophiona is a amphibian that looks a lot like a worm. And for now, I'm just gonna call them worm snakes because I feel like that's easier and it's actually pretty descriptive of the way that they look. They basically just look like a really long worm that kind of looks like a snake as well. But either way, there are variants that come in red, and the longest one has been measured to be 4.5 feet. But then you run into multiple issues. For one, they're not poisonous, and they don't produce any sort of electricity, at least any of the ones that we know. On one hand, their heads and tails are indistinguishable, similar to what's been described as the Mongolian deathworm, and if you were to take a look at these worm snakes, you would see that if you were to scale them up, maybe make them a bit thicker, and you turn it blood red, it would look like the way many people would imagine the Mongolian deathworm to look like. Now, on top of the fact that it's not poisonous, it doesn't produce electricity, those can be easily explainable as traits that are over-exaggerated. Traits that come from phobia of the creature. But there's also the issue that even if this is a Gymnophiona, or even assume that it's an evolved one that somehow made it to the Gobi, they're still amphibians, and they still require a lot of moisture. Yes, there are some amphibians that live in deserts, such as some toads, but for the most part, you're not really gonna find that common, and they're not really gonna be found in Asia. Overall, it does look like one, but because there aren't really any in Asia, never mind in the Gobi Desert, or never mind in any sort of desert-like area remotely close to the Gobi, it's not really a strong contender for the identity of the Mongolian deathworm. Now, likely one of the best possible contenders as to the source of misidentification of the Mongolian deathworm would be the Central Asian pit viper. You see, it's a snake that does live in the Gobi, and it is venomous, but it doesn't really spit it. It doesn't produce electricity, but that is more than likely an over-exaggerated trait of the Mongolian deathworm. But you do have the issue that its skin looks smooth and there are no red variants of this thing. There is the fact that they can grow up to 2 feet, and some can grow to almost 3, and they can reach a thickness similar to that of what is described in the Mongolian deathworm. But overall, while it possesses traits, it's just not really as big. And it doesn't have the electricity or ability to spit venom, and you also have the issue that the head and the tail are pretty distinguishable. You can tell the difference between the head and the tail. Not to mention that it has distinct patterns on it that aren't really described with the Mongolian deathworm. So, more than likely, Central Asian pit viper is a good candidate, much better than the worm snake, but not exactly the best culprit. Now, one of the main issues I have with the existence of the Mongolian deathworm is that you don't find any other creatures like the Mongolian deathworm anywhere else in the world. Sure, perhaps it's just because of geographical isolation, but it's so unique in so many ways that it really just sounds like a legend. I mean, there's no biological evidence to support a creature even like the deathworm can exist in the environment that it lives in. It's just way too dry. That is, of course, if it's a worm. Not to mention it's way too deadly. And perhaps as an over-exaggeration, but that's exactly my point, it's just a legend. The fact that it can spit venom that's so potent it can instantly kill you, and it can produce electricity, is just a bit too much. Now, something I should note is that the electricity isn't actually something reported by the Mongols. It's something that is theorized by individuals who have looked into the circumstances in which people have died from the death worm. Now, in all of the stories that I had told you, all of the individuals who touched the worm instantly died. And that is the main reasoning why is it believed to be electricity. Because direct touch can lead to instant death if it is through electricity. There isn't really much other phenomena that is capable of doing the exact same thing. After all, the geologist touched it with a metal rod and he instantly died. Now, there are other theories as to what this effect could be, but none of them really hold any water. Electricity just so happens to be the best option. But at the same time, there is no terrestrial organism ever to have produced an organ that can produce electricity. Every single creature that can produce electricity is exclusively aquatic. And that's not even the only other issues. I mean, why would it come out in the middle of the hottest months in the year? More than likely, it could just be a mythical creature that was passed down from generation to generation, and there are people who just so happen to believe it. And those who claim to have seen it could have misidentified it with something else. Like I said before with the Central Asian pit viper, even though it doesn't come in red, perhaps at a distance it has his head stuck in the sand, and maybe the fear of the idea of a Mongolian deathworm made them think they saw a Mongolian deathworm. After all, so many natives are so hesitant to say that they saw a deathworm. They mostly say someone else that they know saw the deathworm. And on top of that, none of them can really pinpoint where exactly it prefers to live. Some Mongols say perhaps this place or this other place or this other place, but the point is that it varies a lot. Typically it's in the south, but that's not consistent. You also have the issue that the Gobi Desert isn't really that much sand. It's about 8% covered by sand. So you do have a very restricted region as to where the Mongolian deathworm could even live, assuming it doesn't surface out of the sand. But if it doesn't surface out of the sand, it should make it all the more easier to spot. I should also mention that if this thing is so deadly, shouldn't the deathworm be producing like crazy? Because there is no natural predator that we know of that could kill the deathworm. But who knows? The Gobi bear doesn't exactly have any sort of predators either. Perhaps it's just harder for it to find food, or harder for it to thrive with the lack of water. But overall, all of these issues build up to you really doubting the deathworm's existence. At least, that's for me. Now, in favor of the deathworm's existence as its own unique creature, there's always the chance that the extreme poison doesn't necessarily need to have originated from the worm. You see, none of the Mongols can really describe what exactly the deathworm eats. You see, most worms are carrions, as in they eat dead bodies, which is completely plausible for perhaps the deathworm to do. That's why it doesn't really need to surface, it just eats the dead bodies that sink beneath the sand. But assuming that that isn't the case, perhaps it is also partially an herbivore. Perhaps it could be eating the saxo plants in the local area, which are poisonous. You see, while that may seem implausible as for why the deathworm could eat that and not die from the poison, well, you really only gotta look at the poisonous dart frogs in the Amazon. Those frogs are notorious for being some of the most poisonous animals on Earth. But here's the thing, they don't make the poison, they use it. Their poison originates from the ants that they eat. The ants that they eat have small doses of that venom to fight off other bugs. So what the frogs do is that they take that venom and they build it up to very high concentrations and put that on their skin. That's what makes dart frogs so deadly. And perhaps the Mongolian deathworm is adopting a similar mechanism for having such a deadly concentrated poison. Now, while the electricity may seem a bit extreme, almost all species that generate electricity are unique to their own genus. The only real exception to this is the electric eel, which has at least 3 distinct species that have electricity producing organs, but for the most part, the other 6 species are relatively unique in their own genus. Take, for example, the electric catfish. It's the only known catfish that can produce electricity, and there are a few other species that can also produce their own electricity. So the idea that the Mongolian death worm producing an electrical organ at some point isn't necessarily completely outlandish or unheard of in the animal kingdom. What would be unheard of is the fact that it's terrestrial, but at the same time, again, you still have that element that it being unique wouldn't be something unheard of. Or perhaps overall the deadly features are just an over-exaggeration, as I've mentioned before. But perhaps the organism still actually exists. Now, if it is real, in my opinion, it is likely going to be some species of snake, since only snakes are capable of living in deserts, not worms. At least no worm that we know of. And perhaps the inability to distinguish the head from the tail could be one feature it's just evolved because of its subterranean nature. If you're underground all the time, you don't really need eyes. Now, it would be the first of its kind, but overall, once again, not entirely implausible. Now, in regards to some of the questions that arose when asking about the creature, such as why it would come out in the 2 hottest months in the year, that can actually be explained. You see, for one, as I've mentioned before, the Gobi is a cold desert, and even the hottest months don't always reach excessively hot temperatures. Not to mention, June and July are also the wettest months of the year, and the worm is known for loving moisture. Either way, this doesn't really explain where the worm goes for 10 months. Could it be hibernating for 10 months, or does it simply migrate somewhere else underground? Either way, speculation aside, and assuming that this isn't a unique creature, and that it is actually something known to science, there is a creature that could possibly be the exact identification of the Algoi Krokoi. There is one other animal I still haven't mentioned. One that could be either the inspiration for the sightings, or the inspiration behind the legend. The Tartar sand boa. It's a native to Mongolia. It's extremely poisonous, although it doesn't spit its venom, it injects it through a bite. It is up to 4 feet in length, and here is the kicker. A Mongolian native was shown one and claimed it was the Algoi Krokoi, and said that he was afraid of it. And if all of that still hasn't convinced you, they do come in slight hues of red, and the word Mogoi, meaning snake, isn't exactly used in Mongolia. Instead, the word that is most often used to call snakes is Urt Krokoi, meaning long worm. And the Tartar sand boa is the longest snake in Mongolia. And why would it surface during the hot temperatures? It's a cold-blooded animal, so of course it's going to want to surface in the hot temperatures. The Mongolian death worm, in my opinion, is likely not a real creature. And if it is more than likely nothing like that which we imagined it to be. I doubt the instantly killing venom or electricity are works of actual biological mechanisms, and more than likely the works of fiction. The sightings were accounted by the native Mongols themselves, and there does seem to be exaggerated elements, such as the instant death trope in all of them. Either way, I'm not a native of those lands, and I'm not exactly willing to risk an encounter with a creature who can rapidly send me to the grave before I can behold its terror to see it myself. Whether or not this creature is real, I do believe that the Algoi Krokoi is simply a misidentified and exaggerated Tartar sand boa, and given the fear of a demon of death. You know what? That is simply what I think. I'm curious. What do you believe?